Hi, and welcome back to one of our online lectures here in World History. Today we're going to kick off our unit on classical Greece. We're going to specifically look at the geography and early culture of the Greeks today. And as you've heard me say many times, in order to know who they are, we have to know where they are, because the geography absolutely influences who people are. So we're going to definitely look at that here with the Greeks. So our one question deals directly with that. Our constructive response question today says, identify ways the geography of Greece helped shape Greek culture. And we'll certainly have lots of examples that we can use to put in a short little paragraph that might be on our test at the end of this unit. So let's take a look at our path to learning here, our roadmap. We've got three things we're going to talk about. So naturally, we are going to start with Greek geography. We are going to see how it's different than the previous cultures we've studied, because most of the cultures we've studied have been river cultures. You know, with the Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Yellow and Yangtze River in China, of course the Indus and Ganges rivers in India. But Greece isn't going to be focused on rivers. They are going to have a lot of water that they have access to, but it won't be rivers. The second thing we're going to talk about is we're going to briefly look at the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, and the Dorians. These are early cultures that influenced the Greeks. So we'll just talk about kind of what each of those groups provided the Greeks and how the Greeks borrowed from them. And then, of course, number three, we'll look at the Greek culture that develops. And it's the Greek culture that permeates through Greek history, Greek mythology, shipbuilding, things like that. So it's going to kind of be our beginning to the Greek story, so to speak. So those are the three things we're going to look at. Let's go ahead and get started here today. Let's set the stage here with geography and early culture. The geography of the ancient Greeks was considerably different than the previous cultures we have studied, namely because water is going to matter, but not in the same way that it did on the previous civilizations. For example, we talked about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers with Mesopotamia. We looked at the Indus and Ganges rivers with India. We looked at the Yellow and Yangtze rivers with China, and of course the Nile in Egypt. But that's not the case here with Greece. They're going to have access to water, but just not with rivers. We're also going to talk about those cultures I just mentioned on the previous slide. So the culture of the ancient Greeks was shaped by several different cultures: the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, and the Dorians. And as I mentioned, we're going to very briefly look at each one of those in just a short minute here. So if you're wondering where Greece is, let's take a look at this map. Of course, here you have Europe, and you have to kind of go down to the southeast end of Europe, right here in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And that's going to matter. Water is going to be a big part of this story today. Here's a zoomed in version. Here you have Greece. To the left, you have the Ionian Sea. To the west, I should say. To the east, you have the Aegean Sea, and then, of course, you have the Mediterranean Sea down here. So they are indeed surrounded by water, and we're going to talk about all three of those bodies of water here. So, geography shapes Greek life. Well, the ancient Greeks certainly had some issues when it came to geography. For example, ancient Greece most consisted of a mountainous peninsula jutting out into the Mediterranean Sea. Those mountains are going to make it difficult for trade and for farming. In the Aegean and Ionian Seas, you have a lot of islands. So mainland Greece is not necessarily just mainland. It's definitely made up of a lot of islands. So over 2,000 islands are a part of what will become Greece in the Aegean and Ionian Seas. The sea was to Greece what rivers were to Egypt and Mesopotamia. And what I mean by that is simply what I mentioned earlier, is that the rivers were so important to those previous civilizations, and Greece isn't going to have access. Doesn't mean they don't have rivers, but they don't have rivers that were as useful as those previous civilizations. So they had to rely on the sea to get a lot of their food and to trade and things like that. So you'll see that being a big theme as we progress here with the Greeks. It was said that the Greeks did not live on the land, but they lived around the sea. So that's just a famous phrase that certainly describes who the Greeks were. Because of this access to water, the Greeks had to become master shipbuilders. So the Greeks became master shipbuilders due to sea trade. They're going to be some of the first to really pioneer naval battles and ships that can travel further on rougher seas. Not exactly ocean-going travel quite yet, but their ships will be pretty awesome, and we'll certainly look at those here coming up. So here's just another look. This is a physical map of Greece. You can see a lot of the city-states that we are going to mention here. But one thing I really like about this map in particular is you can see the mountains here, everything in brown or this tan color. There's very little green here, and that's definitely an indication of how difficult the land would be for the Greeks to farm and to trade. Because of course trade means you have to travel, and if you have to travel over hills and mountains, that makes it very, very difficult. So this map shows that quite well. So Greece lacked natural resources such as farming, timber, and precious metals. Doesn't mean they didn't have it, they just didn't have a lot of it. That's going to make trade being far more necessary for the Greeks. Rugged mountains covered 3/4 of ancient Greece. You saw that on the previous map. So it's very, very mountainous. The mountains divided up Greece into several different territories and really shaped their political life. When we talk about what a city-state is, that really is shaped because those cities are not connected to one another. They're disconnected because of those hills and mountains. Uneven terrain made difficult for travel, so we've definitely mentioned that. And because of the terrain, large-scale irrigation was not possible. You really couldn't bring water in. You didn't have aqueducts like the Romans would have. You didn't have canals. The topography of the soil, the mountains, it's just very, very difficult to bring water through. So because of all this, the land could not sustain a large population. When we talk about Athens and Sparta, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people. You're talking maybe 30,000, maybe 50,000, maybe 100,000 at the biggest, but certainly not much bigger than that. The climate was really nice. The climate varied from 48 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter to 80 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, and that certainly would sound good here in Minnesota. Okay, so we've established their geography. And we're going to continue to talk about how that shapes their culture in a little bit. But if we're going to talk about culture, we have to look at those who provided some culture to the Greeks. So we're going to bring that geography piece back into this in a little bit, which will help us answer our question, as well as we're going to look at these different groups that preceded the Greeks that passed on their culture and was later absorbed into what would be considered Greek culture. We're going to start with the Minoans. So early cultures influenced Greeks. Again, I said there's 4 of them: the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, and the Dorians. So let's start with that first group called the Minoans. And we're just going to take a small snapshot of each one of these. In fact, these are not on your test. There is one question about them on the test, and I'll tell you where that's going to pop up here in a little bit. But this is definitely part of the story. So I'm not going to test you on it, but I am going to introduce the Greeks by kind of giving you their background. So let's look at the Minoans here very, very briefly. The Minoans gave the Greeks architecture, burial customs, and religious rituals. So we know the Greeks are definitely going to be very good at building things. We are going to look at the Parthenon and some of their other buildings that they created. Religion's a big part of the Greeks. Know anything about Greek mythology and like Zeus and Apollo and all these different gods. A lot of that came from the Minoans. The Minoans were very outdoorsy people, so they were very outdoorsy and athletic like the Greeks. And you can see the 2 images here below indicating the Olympic Games. We won't talk a lot about the Olympic Games in this unit, but the Greeks do invent the Olympics, and certainly their athletic ability and outdoor activities were borrowed here from the Minoan people. Here's an image of the early Greek Olympic Games. So it's a little snapshot on who the Minoans were. The next group is the Phoenicians. If you notice, here's ancient Greece. The Minoans came from down here. That's what the early map represented. But we have to travel quite a bit further east over to Palestine to find where the Phoenicians were located. So they're going to be our second group that we're going to talk about, but they are definitely going to influence the Greeks. So the Phoenicians. One of the things you hear out of Phoenicians is phonetic. So they gave the world the phonetic alphabet. This will make more sense on the next slide when I show you a chart, but basically a lot of the language that we use today, both written and spoken, came from the phonetic alphabet. The Romans are going to adapt it, and it'll slowly become turn into the language that we use today, of course, which is English. One of the other things that was really unique about the Phoenicians is they were really, really good shipbuilders. So they were excellent merchant shipbuilders, and they definitely had a strong influence on the Greeks and influenced Greek shipbuilding. And you can tell by this map, it's kind of small, but if Phoenicia was over here, look at these green lines. This shows you where the Phoenicians traveled. So they went all over the Mediterranean Sea. They even came out into the Atlantic Ocean. Notice how they hugged the coastline. They wouldn't have gone out and done a lot of ocean-going travel, but they made it all the way up to Great Britain. And even were able to travel up here in the Aegean and through up into the Black Sea. So there's no doubt their shipbuilding skills were top-notch for the time, and the Greeks will certainly take a lot of those skills and absorb that into their own culture. So when I said there's going to be one test question on your test about any of these groups, hint, hint, wink, wink, I would pay close attention to the Phoenicians. So here's that chart I was telling you about. Here we've got some different languages. For example, you have Egyptian hieroglyphics. You can see kind of what some of these stood for. But if we move over the chart a little bit, here we have the Phoenician alphabet. Doesn't look like much to you and I, but it slowly sort of morphed. And it's hard to see that, but it morphs over into Greek, and it moves over into becoming Roman. And by the time we get to the, whoops, let me go back there. By the time we get to the Roman language, which of course would have been used primarily through Latin, you can see some similarities here between the two of them. So there's no doubt the phonetic alphabet comes from the Phoenicians. All right, that's going to be the end of part one. We'll continue on talking about two more groups that influenced the Greeks as well as Greek culture on part two of this lecture. So go ahead and please play part two.